Well, good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be with you. I'm grateful to be here. And I can't tell you how much in the last couple of years I've come to like and appreciate Pat. And I tell people this all the time, I absolutely believe that this congregation has one of the best preachers that our movement has to offer. And he is not only a skilled homiletician, but he's a good person. So I want you to know what a gift that you have with Pat. And also, like Pat said, I went to college with Chad. As a matter of fact, we were roommates. I think some things about Chad, too. I'm one of those kids that pretty much grew up in the church. Matter of fact, one of my favorite lines from any movie is at the beginning of the movie The Jerk. Steve Martin says, "I was born a poor black child in Mississippi." Which was funny for him, but it's actually true for me. I did grow up a poor black child in Mississippi. I was raised on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi, in a little town that no one's ever heard of called Goshen, Mississippi. And two memories that dominate my mind from being a boy in the 70s and 80s are playing baseball and my little church, the Goshen Church of Christ. And the Goshen Church of Christ was one of those hardcore, hardline, old-time religion kind of churches, and they liked it that way. My parents helped plant that church, and it was at the center of our lives. And I remember being 8 years old, and there was some traveling preacher who was coming through a town not far from where we live, the big city, which we thought of as Biloxi, Mississippi. Now we thought Biloxi was a big city because they had a mall. And when you live in Goshen, Mississippi, any city that's got a mall is a big city. So my dad was very fired up about this traveling preacher who was coming through town. And so he decided that we would all go and hear this guy. And it was on a Thursday night, and my parents were very strict about bedtimes and that sort of thing. So I knew it was a big deal that we were going to Biloxi on a Thursday night, and it was going to be a school night. As a matter of fact, in order to be there on time, we had to be picked up right after school and drive to Biloxi, and my dad and mom were going to do something that we never did. I knew this night was special because we ate out. And we never ate out. Like, here's my dad. We would stop at McDonald's, and my brother and I would sit in the back seat, and we would really want a cheeseburger. And that was back in the days when a cheeseburger at McDonald's was 39 cents. But it was 29 cents if you didn't get the cheese. And so we would tell my dad, "Hey, can we have a cheeseburger? Can we have a cheeseburger?" "No, we got cheese at home." And so he loaded us in the car, and he took us to Biloxi, and we had dinner at this place called the Cock of the Walk, and my brother and I loved this dinner. We thought it was high dining. It wasn't until I was older that I realized that buffets weren't really fine dining. But when you're 8, you're good for it. It's good for you. And we loved that night and having dinner at that place, and we begged my dad to take us back again, and he promised that he would, though he never has. Another memory of that night is that we did go and we listened to this preacher who was coming through Biloxi, and the place was absolutely packed. And what I remember about that is that he preached so long. Like, he may still be there preaching. And it was one of those things because I was raised in the pew, and that was back in the days where everybody had Sunday night church, and my mother would never let my brother and me go to sleep during Sunday night church. We would sit next to her, and if we kind of dozed off, she would do that pinch thing where she kind of dug in your leg and twisted, and you end up screaming because it hurt so hard. But if you ended up screaming, you got into even more trouble than if you fell asleep. But he preached so long that she let us fall asleep and didn't wake us up. And I remember waking up from my slumber, and they were singing, Just As I Am. And as he's singing, Just As I Am, the song leader's down there, and he's leading, and everyone's into it, and the preacher would stop him. And between every verse, he would tell some story about somebody who wanted to get baptized or was planning to get baptized, but something happened on the way to church, or they had a heart attack coming down the aisle, and so you better come on and get it right now. Then he'd crank up that song leader again for another verse of Just As I Am. We sang that song so long. I think that the song leader just started making up lyrics to Just As I Am as we went on. And it's already got 6 verses, and I think he's just doing some free rhyme right off the top of his head. They may still be there singing Just As I Am. I don't know. But that was my experience as a boy. And I loved that little church and carried precious memories. I remember when the men of that congregation built the building with their bare hands, and all of us boys would run up there and go to the church building with them on weekday nights, thinking that we were going to have something to contribute to the effort. And we just ran around and played hide and go seek in the midst of this huge rolled insulation that was sitting everywhere. And I remember being a witness to my father's own baptism. One year at VBS, they had a contest to see who could bring the most people to VBS. And I won that year. And they gave you a little trophy called the Fishers of Men trophy. I won a lot of trophies in my life. My mom still has that Fishers of Men trophy. I remember when my older brother Richard was thinking about being baptized. And our preacher was coming over to the house one summer afternoon to talk to him about his own baptism. But we had very strict rules about who was allowed in the house when my parents weren't home. And the rule went like this: no one's allowed in the house when we're not home. And so our preacher came over. And I remember my brother standing on the inside of our front door and our preacher standing on the outside of our front door for an hour talking about baptism. And I remember the scandal that was caused when our usual song leader let his unbaptized son take communion one Sunday morning. And I remember the personal tumult in our own family when my dad was up to be a deacon. And there were some people who objected because he didn't come to Wednesday night church because he was taking classes finishing his master's. I was a child of the church. And I love the church, and everything about my life has been centered around the church. But when I look around our world, there are fewer and fewer people like me. Back when we were living in Houston, one of my good friends there was the director of music at the local Church of Christ private school. And they were putting on a talent show, and he knew that my family had a background in music. My father had been a band director, and everyone in my family had played some instrument or did something with music. So he asked me to come over and be a judge at the school talent show. And so it's all junior high and high school students at this talent show. And I say, yeah, I'll come over and I'll be a judge. And it was just what you would expect. Little talent and a lot of show. And you've got junior high kids up there jumping around, and you can't really figure out what it is. But there was this one girl who was 15. And she came up on stage to sing a song, and they handed her the mic. And it was absolutely incredible. And there was no live band there, so they just played a track in the sound booth, and she just sang over the track. And apparently she had already been offered some sort of recording contract with some people, and she was amazing. And this was no competition. This talent show wasn't in doubt at any moment because she was clearly going to win. But as a matter of fact, she sang and then went off stage, and then they had some other people come up. You know, someone comes up to juggle, tell jokes that nobody gets, junior high stuff. But she was so good that they invited her back on stage to sing another song. The problem was that there was difficulty in the sound room and they couldn't get the track to play. And here's this poor 15-year-old girl just standing on the stage with a microphone. And at first, everyone's silent, just kind of waiting for her to get started. And then you know how when silence goes on for too long, there's that little murmur that starts to creep up in an audience? Well, and now this is awkward for her, and it's awkward for the audience, and the kid back in the sound booth is just going like this, and he doesn't know what's happening. And so people begin to just shout words of encouragement to her. They're like, "You go, girl, you great, you're awesome, you do it, you're beautiful." And then every now and then in a crowd, you may have noticed that when everyone's loud, just every so often, the sound just drops out of the bottom and everybody gets quiet. And so while everybody's shouting words of encouragement to her, we have one of those moments and everybody gets quiet and you hear one girl from the back just yell out, "Girl, just sing it a cappella." She didn't even know the word a cappella. For 40 years, my life, maybe like some of your lives, has centered around the church. And I was raised in this community of people that loves Jesus and taught me to love Jesus. And I am eternally grateful for it. And I realized something as I got older into my teenage and college years that began to disturb me. That for so many of the people that raised me and taught me to love Jesus, that Jesus wasn't actually their first love. Their first love was really the religion that they had created around Jesus. And every so often, when they had to make a choice between the Jesus thing and the religion thing, they chose the religion thing. That we had built this whole thing around a religion and we had done it well. Because you all know what it's like to love something. Like when you love something, you care for it, you nurture it, you protect it. And that's exactly what we should do when it comes to church and religion, because it's important and it's meaningful. And the church is special and beautiful, and it is a fount of redemption in our world. And trying to malign the church or religion, or trying to malign the church and what we do on a Sunday morning together, like that is shameful, bordering on sinful. But my greatest fear is that in our desire to love the church, too many of us begin to fall in love with the religion that we've built around Jesus and a particular set of practices of that religion. And we fall out of love with Jesus. That what we really love are the splinters of the cross and not the cross itself. Here's how that works, and you know it already. That God gives us some sort of rule or some sort of guideline. And to protect ourselves from breaking that rule, we create another rule, another guideline on top of it. And then we create a third and a fourth to protect us all the way down. And what we end up with before we know it is just a house of rules. And in the end, all of the rules just add up to the fading chalk outline of what used to be real life. But when we pick up the Bible, the Bible never seems that way. The Bible never seems to be stuck, because when I read about Jesus, Jesus is always breaking the rules, he's always on the move, and he's always sitting at the wrong table. And as religious people, our temptation, we are often inclined to settle down and make a religion. But Jesus never seems to be interested in settling down. Because as soon as we try to take our Jesus and put him up on the shelf, we turn around and find out that Jesus has moved. Jesus is the most unpredictable elf on the shelf ever. And we're not the first people who have ever done this. Religious people all throughout time, going back to the time that Jesus walked himself, have tried to create ways to put Jesus on a shelf. And this is how it bubbles up in Mark 2. A few people have questions for Jesus. And Mark tells us this. He says, the disciples of John the Baptist and the Pharisees made a practice of fasting. Why is it that John's followers and the Pharisees' followers fast, but your disciples are eating and drinking like it was any other day? Hold up, Jesus, you got some explaining to do. Because you're going around telling us, other people are telling us, that's what the headlines are saying, that you're supposed to be some kind of religious leader. That's what the news is. That's what everybody's talking about on Twitter. But how in the world can you be a religious leader if you don't follow all the rules that we've created? If you don't practice the rules the same way that we practice the rules? And Jesus says this. Guests at the wedding can't fast when the bridegroom is with them. It would be wrong to do anything but feast. When the bridegroom is snatched away from them, then the time will come to fast and mourn. Look, Jesus says, I'm about to blow your mind. Following me, Jesus says, listen, following me requires discernment. Walking with God isn't always going to look the same. And you and I are going to have to become the kind of people who have a sense of when it's right to feast and when it's right to fast. Because if we don't develop that kind of discernment, we're going to be fasting when it's supposed to be time for feasting. And we're going to be feasting when we're supposed to be fasting. And if we go around doing that, we are going to be out of touch with the thing that God is doing. And Jesus goes on. He says, these are new things I'm teaching, and they can't be reconciled with old habits. Nobody would ever use a piece of new cloth to patch an old garment, because when the patch shrinks, it pulls away and makes the tear even worse. And nobody puts new, unfermented wine into old wineskins, because if he does, the wine will burst the skins. They would lose both the wineskins and the wine. No. The only appropriate thing is to put new wine into new wineskin. And Jesus says, these are some new things. There are new things that I'm teaching the Spirit of God. God is moving in a new way. God is doing new things. And there are some of us who love that. We just love new things. There's nothing better in the world than something shiny. Hot off the presses. The latest and the greatest. For some of us, if it's a new idea, it's a good idea. And that's why Apple has all of our money. We don't need a watch that does the same things that our phone already does, but it's new and we'll get one. But when Jesus says new, he's not talking about new for the sake of new. New and improved is a marketing statement, not a mission statement. Jesus wants us looking for the new because he's always doing something new. And if you're not looking for the new, you'll miss what Jesus is doing. Wineskins age with the wine that's in them. And if you put new wine into that old wineskin, then the wineskin will burst and you'll waste the wine. For 3 years, our family lived in Northern California. And one summer, my wife Rochelle and I decided that we wanted to take just a little 3-day trip to Napa. And so that's what we decided to do. So for 3 days, we visited Napa, and we went to as many wine tastings as we could stand. And if you don't like the idea of a preacher going to wine tastings, just consider it communion. That's what we did. And when you go to Napa and you pay for an expensive bed and breakfast, and you pay for all the expensive meals, and you go to all the tastings, what you're really getting is an education. Because at the best tastings, they'll sit you down and they'll talk about the earth and the minerals in that part of Northern California that contribute to the taste of the wine. And they'll tell you about grape rotation and fermentation and crust and crushing the grapes and everything that goes into it. And they'll even tell you about the kind of glass that certain wine lives best in. And what you learn is that these vintners go through all of this trouble because wine is really valuable. And it's worth going through whatever trouble you need to go through to not waste the wine. In the simplest terms, Jesus is telling us that if we are not open and welcoming to the new thing that he is doing, then we are going to waste the wine. And for me and for you, one of the hardest things that we'll ever do is embrace the idea that God can do a new thing. And for some of us, it just boils down to our church life, our religious practice. That we've done one thing, or we've done this certain set of things for so long that we found life in, that it's really hard to believe that God is going to do a new thing. Because this old thing has been so meaningful to us. And Jesus never comes along and says, old wine is terrible, you never should have drank it. He's just saying, I'm doing a new thing. It's hard to embrace that God is doing a new thing. And maybe for some of us, it's our marriage. That you've been in it for so long, and you've been with this person, you've been with this husband, this wife for so long, and they've always been this way. And you've tried to change it, you've tried to nag it away and pray it away and talk it away, but it's still there, but it's still under your skin, and you know that it's not healthy for your marriage, but you tell yourself, you know, it's been so long, it's been 20, it's been 30, it's been 40, 50 years. It is what it is. But Jesus never says, it is what it is. Jesus says, this is a new thing. Maybe for you, it's your relationship with your children or with your parents. Maybe you grew up in a house where your parents were a certain way, and you got out of that as fast as you could. And you've tried, you've leaned in a couple of times to make things better, but it never seems to get better, so you just gave up. And Jesus comes and he says to you this morning, I can do a new thing. And maybe it is with your kids. They've been trouble, and they're getting around close to 16, 17, 18, and you are marking off days on the calendar to get them out of the house. Because it's been hard. And you have been on your knees for years. And you don't think it's ever going to change. But Jesus says, I think I've got a new thing for you. And maybe it's a relationship at work, some other relationship in your family. Maybe you live with a sense of tension with someone that you know that you're supposed to show more love to. But it's been so long now. The wounds are so old. But Jesus says, I can do a new thing. My grandmother almost gave up on Jesus being able to do a new thing. My grandmother started to worship at the Woodrow Wilson Church of Christ in Jackson, Mississippi in 1955, when a lady from across the street walked over and invited her and her daughter, my mom, to worship. My grandmother had been left by my biological grandfather. To this day, I still don't know if they were ever married, but they did have my mother. But in the intervening years, she had remarried. And he was the only grandfather that I really knew. And in great customary Mississippi fashion, we called him Big Daddy. For over 40 years, sometime with my mother before she left, my grandmother would get up every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday evening, and go to worship, go to church with the Woodrow Wilson Church of Christ. And my grandfather never went with her. She nagged and complained and invited and all the things that all of us do. And he never went. He liked to get up in the morning and put on his boots and grab his shotgun and go out to our land, and he'd have to slop the pigs or he'd go hunting for something, but never went to church. She would try to talk to him about it, and he thought it was kind of silly and dumb, and he wasn't interested. When I was 24 years old, my grandmother received a knock on the door. And it was a young man. He was a couple years older than I was, and he was looking for my Big Daddy. And she said, why are you looking for him? He's not here. And he said, because he's my father. And he was the first one, and then there was another one, and there was another one, and there was another one. All these children that my grandmother had never heard of or knew anything about. So at the time my mother was having me, he was out having all kinds of kids on his own. And she was broken. And I was working for a congregation in South Texas at the time, and I remember in the middle of the day talking with her on the phone. And for a strong, stoic woman, listening to her in her old age weep. Well, she decided that she would just keep doing what she always did. And she worked there at their congregation in the food pantry on Tuesdays. Just one random Tuesday, he decided that he would want to come and help her. And so he did. And that next Sunday, as he was sitting on the couch, he was about to leave, and he pops up and says, "Hey, you going to church this morning?" Yeah, he says, "Can I come with you?" Well, she didn't want to seem too excited. Yeah. And at the end of service that day, they were singing the invitation song. My grandfather walked down the aisle and asked to be baptized. Now, I figured he did that because he was new, and everybody knows you don't really go down forward at the invitation song. At least not in the churches that I've been in. That night, my grandmother called me, and we talked on the phone, and I don't know if you've ever had the experience of actually being able to see someone smile from the other end of the phone. But I could. That next Saturday night, before he was preparing to get up and go to church for the second time ever, he finished dinner, walked into the living room, laid down on the couch, and died. Probably because God knew that he wasn't going to be good for long. These are new things. Jesus says, I am doing a new thing. And what my job is, and what your job is to watch and pray that we see, know, and notice the new thing. Because as Jesus finishes saying, no, the only appropriate thing is to put new wine into new wineskin. Let's pray together. God, would you teach us to see the new and to be open for what you are doing, even though sometimes we won't like it or notice it. But God, would you begin to pry open the parts of our lives and hearts that want to keep you on lockdown. God, give us the strength to take you off the shelf and join you wherever you're moving. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amazing grace.